The desert sun beats down mercilessly on the cracked earth of New Mexico Territory, 1887. When 23-year-old Thomas Brennan receives a telegram informing him of his uncle's death and an unexpected inheritance, he imagines vast pastures and a fresh start in the Wild West. But nothing could prepare him for what awaits at the Broken Spur Ranch. On his first night, as he explores the dilapidated stable by lantern light, Thomas discovers 5 bodies hanging from the rafters. Apache warriors, their faces frozen in silent agony, their traditional clothing torn and bloodied. The discovery sends ice through his veins. Who were these men? Who killed them? And why would his uncle keep such a horrific secret hidden in the shadows of his property? As Thomas stands alone in that stable, surrounded by death and darkness, he realizes he hasn't just inherited a ranch. He has inherited a mystery that will force him to confront the brutal truth about the land he now owns, the uncle he thought he knew, and the violent history written in blood across the desert soil. Thomas Brennan had never seen country like this before. Raised in Boston among cobblestone streets and gas lamps, he found the New Mexico Territory almost alien in its vastness. The train journey west had taken 4 days, each mile carrying him further from everything familiar. His uncle, Marcus Brennan, had left Massachusetts 30 years ago, chasing stories of opportunity and freedom in the untamed lands beyond the Mississippi. The family had received sporadic letters over the years, each one painting pictures of desert sunsets and successful cattle operations. Then the letters stopped coming. 3 months passed before the telegram arrived at Thomas's boarding house. Marcus Brennan deceased. Stop. You are sole heir. Stop. Come immediately. Stop. The wagon ride from the nearest town of Socorro took another full day. The driver, a weathered Mexican man named Vicente, spoke little English, but his expression said enough. When Thomas mentioned the Broken Spur Ranch, Vicente's face darkened. He made the sign of the cross and muttered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Thomas pressed him for information about his uncle, about the ranch, about why it had earned such a foreboding name. But Vicente only shook his head and urged the horses faster across the desert floor. They arrived at sunset. The ranch house stood alone against the amber sky, a 2-story structure of adobe and timber that had seen better days. The roof sagged in places, windows were broken, and sand had drifted against the walls like snowbanks. A large stable sat 50 yards from the main house, its doors hanging open on rusted hinges. Corrals lay empty, fences broken. No cattle grazed the sparse grasslands. No horses stamped in their stalls. The place felt abandoned, forgotten by time and man alike. Vicente refused to stay even for a night's payment. He unloaded Thomas's trunk, accepted his money, and departed before the last light faded from the sky. Thomas stood in the gathering darkness, listening to the wagon wheels fade into silence, suddenly aware of how profoundly alone he was. Miles from the nearest town, surrounded by desert and mountains, with only the wind for company. He picked up his lantern and decided to survey his new property before nightfall claimed everything. The ranch house interior matched the exterior's decay. Dust covered every surface thick as carpet. Furniture sat draped in sheets like ghosts. His uncle's personal effects remained scattered about a pipe on the mantel, books on shelves, a half-finished letter on the desk dated 6 months prior. The letter began, "Dear Thomas," but contained only a single line. "There are things you need to understand about this land. Nothing more." The pen lay beside it, as if Marcus had been interrupted mid-thought and never returned. Thomas found bedding and made himself as comfortable as possible in the master bedroom. Through the broken window, he could see the stable silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Something about it drew his attention, a feeling he couldn't name. Tomorrow he would need to inventory everything, assess what could be salvaged and what needed repair. The lawyer in Socorro had been vague about the ranch's finances, mentioning only that there were complications and local disputes that Thomas would need to address. But tonight, Exhaustion pulled at him. The journey had been long, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges. He lay down on the dusty bed, listening to the wind whistle through the broken windows, and tried not to think about Vicenti's fearful reaction or his uncle's unfinished letter. Sleep came eventually, restless and filled with strange dreams of shadows moving across desert sand. He woke near midnight to the sound of something banging in the wind. The stable door, he realized. It must have blown open wider. The noise was rhythmic, insistent, making sleep impossible. With a resigned sigh, Thomas lit his lantern and headed outside to secure it. The desert night was cold, a sharp contrast to the day's heat. Stars blazed overhead in numbers he'd never seen in the city. His breath misted in the lamplight as he crossed the yard toward the stable. The smell hit him first. Thomas stopped 10 feet from the stable entrance, his lantern raised, his stomach turning. The odor wasn't the expected smell of old hay and animal waste. This was something else. Something organic and wrong. Death had a scent. He'd learned that when his father passed, and this carried that same sweet sick quality magnified 100-fold. His hand trembled as he forced himself forward, every instinct screaming to turn back, to return to the house, to leave this place entirely. The lantern light penetrated the darkness slowly, pushing back shadows to reveal the stable's interior. Empty stalls lined both walls. Broken equipment lay scattered across the dirt floor. Saddles rotted on their racks. And hanging from the central beam, suspended by ropes around their necks, were 5 bodies. Thomas's lantern slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the ground, but mercifully staying lit. His legs gave out and he fell to his knees, unable to look away from the horrific sight. The bodies were those of native men, Apache warriors by their dress and appearance. They had been dead for some time, weeks perhaps, based on the state of decomposition, but not long enough for the desert air to fully mummify them. Their faces were contorted, eyes sunken, mouths frozen open. Each wore traditional Apache clothing now stained and torn. Their hands had been bound behind their backs. This wasn't execution. This was lynching, murder. Thomas scrambled backward out of the stable, making it several yards before his stomach emptied itself onto the desert sand. He remained there on his hands and knees, retching and shaking, his mind unable to process what he'd seen. His uncle. His uncle had done this, or known about it, or allowed it to happen on his property. The kind man from childhood memories, who'd sent letters filled with wonder about the West, who'd left Thomas everything he owned. That man had harbored this monstrosity in his stable. When the shaking finally subsided, Thomas forced himself to think. He couldn't leave the bodies hanging there. They deserved burial, dignity, whatever he could offer them now. But more than that, he needed to understand what had happened, the how and the why. The unfinished letters suddenly took on new significance. There are things you need to understand about this land. Dawn found Thomas in the ranch house, searching desperately through his uncle's papers for answers. He pulled open every drawer, examined every document, read every letter. Slowly, a story began to emerge from the fragments. Marcus Brennan had arrived in New Mexico with dreams of cattle ranching, but the land he'd claimed had complications. It sat at the edge of territory traditionally used by Apache bands traveling between the mountains and the desert. Conflicts had arisen. Cattle disappeared. Ranch hands were found dead. Marcus had written to territorial authorities, begging for protection, for soldiers, for someone to address the Indian problem. Then Thomas found his uncle's journal, hidden in a locked drawer whose key hung on a chain around a bedpost. The final entries were dated 2 weeks before Marcus's death. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the entries shorter and more cryptic. They came in the night. My men caught 5 of them in the barn, said they were stealing horses, said they would handle it. I should have stopped them. God forgive me, I should have stopped them. Another entry, days later. Can't sleep, can't eat. I see their faces. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16. What have I become in this godforsaken place? The final entry was a single sentence. I'm already dead. Thomas discovered his uncle's body that afternoon, buried in a shallow grave behind the house, marked only by a pile of stones. Marcus had shot himself, the old rifle still lying beside his bones. He'd done it shortly after writing that last journal entry, unable to live with what had happened in his stable. The ranch hands he'd employed had vanished, taking whatever horses and valuables remained. They'd left Marcus alone with his guilt and his ghosts, but they'd left the bodies hanging as a message. Or perhaps as evidence they couldn't risk hiding. Or maybe they simply didn't care. Thomas spent 3 days burying the dead. He started with his uncle, digging a proper grave on a hill overlooking the ranch, marking it with a wooden cross carved from stable timber. Then came the harder task, the 5 Apache warriors. He couldn't bring himself to cut them down at first. Instead, he rode the 20 miles to Socorro, pushing a borrowed mule to its limits, arriving at the marshal's office exhausted and desperate. Marshal Owen Garrett was a thick-necked man with gray whiskers and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence to be shocked by anything. He listened to Thomas's story with minimal expression, occasionally spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. When Thomas finished, breathless and expecting immediate action, the marshal leaned back in his chair and studied him with something like pity. "Son, you need to understand something about how things work out here," Garrett said slowly. "What you're describing, if it happened the way you say, that's unfortunate. Real unfortunate. But those were Apache warriors. Geronimo's still fresh in everyone's mind. Folks around here, they've lost family, lost friends, lost livelihoods to raids. You go stirring up trouble over 5 dead Apache, and you'll find yourself more alone than you already are." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "They were murdered, hanged, on my property. That's not justice. That's the West," Garrett interrupted. "Your uncle's ranch hands? I can guess who they were. The Dalton boys and their crew. They work for a man named Clayton Voss now, runs the biggest operation in 3 counties. Those boys handle Voss's dirty work, and Voss has friends in Santa Fe. You make accusations without proof, without witnesses, against men like that." He shook his head. "Best thing you can do is bury those bodies quiet, sell the ranch, and go back east where you belong. I can't just— You can and you will if you're smart." Garrett's voice hardened. "This ain't Boston. We don't have your city laws and your newspapers and your courts that care about every little thing. We have survival. We have order maintained through strength. You want to honor those men? Bury them proper and move on. Anything else is suicide." Thomas left the marshal's office feeling hollowed out. He'd grown up believing in justice, in law, in the fundamental rightness of civilization. But here, those concepts seemed as fragile as morning frost under the desert sun. He purchased supplies, a pickaxe, a shovel, cloth for wrapping bodies, and rode back to the ranch as sunset painted the mountains blood red. That night, a visitor arrived. Thomas was in the stable, having finally worked up the courage to begin the grim task of cutting down the first body, when he heard a horse approach. He emerged with his knife still in hand, covered in sweat and dust, to find an old Apache man sitting on a painted mare, watching him with eyes black as obsidian. They stared at each other across the darkening yard. The old man's face was a map of wrinkles, his long gray hair bound with leather cords. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache dress and cavalry pants, clearly taken from some previous encounter. A rifle rested across his saddle, but his hands didn't move toward it. He simply watched and waited. Thomas found his voice finally. "I'm burying them," he said, gesturing toward the stable. "I'm trying to give them proper burial." The old man said nothing for a long moment. Then he dismounted with surprising grace for his age and walked toward Thomas until they stood face to face. His eyes searched Thomas's face, seeming to read something there. When he spoke, His English was accented but clear. "You are not your uncle." "No," Thomas agreed. "I'm not. These men were my son's hunting party. They came to take horses. This I do not deny. Your uncle's men did not need to kill them. They could have driven them away. They chose murder." The old man's voice remained steady, but Thomas could hear the ocean of grief beneath it. "My son hangs in that building. His name was Naki Tats. He had 20 winters. He will never see 21. Thomas felt tears burning his eyes. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. Your sorrow changes nothing, but your actions might." The old man turned to look at the mountains, dark shapes against the starlit sky. "There are others who want revenge, who say the white man's ranch should burn, that the white man who owns it should hang as our sons hung. I tell them no. I tell them I will see first what kind of man has come to this cursed place." He turned back to Thomas, and his next words carried the weight of prophecy. "You have a choice, young one. You can bury our dead and leave, as the marshal surely told you to do. Or you can stay and seek justice for murders committed on your land. But know this, if you stay, if you choose that path, you choose war. Not with my people, but with the men who truly rule this territory." Thomas chose to stay. That decision, made in the darkness with an Apache elder bearing witness, changed the course of his life irrevocably. Together, he and the old man who gave his name as Goyafle, though he said white men had once called him something else, spent the next 2 days properly burying the 5 warriors. Goyafle taught Thomas the Apache way, the songs that should be sung, the direction the body should face, the items that should be left with them for their journey to the afterlife. As they worked, Goyafle told Thomas about each man. Nakitats, his son, had been training to become a shaman, learning the healing songs from his grandfather. Delshe had a wife and 3 children waiting for him, children who would now grow up without a father. The youngest, barely 16 as Marcus's journal had noted, was named Cochise after the great chief, born in the year the wars were supposed to have ended. The other 2 were brothers, Kastazidin and Nach, who had never been separated in life and now rested side by side in death. "You understand what you face?" Goyafle asked on the second evening, as they stood beside the completed graves marked with stones and crude wooden crosses bearing the men's names. "Clayton Voss controls everything from here to the Texas border. Cattle, water, land, and the men who enforce his will. The Dalton boys are just his dogs, but they are dogs with teeth. They killed my son and his companions because Voss wants this land, wants to expand his empire. Your uncle stood in his way. Then my uncle died for this land," Thomas said quietly. "The least I can do is honor that sacrifice. Your uncle died because he was weak. Kindly. He had courage enough to claim land, but not enough to defend it or to stand against injustice when it happened in front of him. You must be stronger." Over the following weeks, Thomas learned that strength came in unexpected forms. He rebuilt the ranch methodically, repairing fences and the stable roof, clearing out the decay. He rode to Socorro and spoke to the few townspeople willing to talk to him, gathering information about Voss and the Dalton brothers. The picture that emerged was of a ruthless cattle baron who'd built his empire through intimidation, violence, and convenient alliances with corrupt territorial officials. The Dalton boys, Jack, Robert, and their cousin Samuel, were known throughout the territory as brutal enforcers. They'd been involved in at least a dozen killings that people whispered about, but no one would testify to. They worked from Voss's main ranch, the 3 Rivers Spread, which sprawled across 50,000 acres of prime grazing land. Voss had been trying to acquire the Broken Spur for years, making Marcus increasingly lower offers, until finally resorting to intimidation. But Thomas also discovered allies. A Mexican rancher named Esteban Torres, whose own spread bordered the Broken Spur, rode over one morning with supplies and a warning. "Voss knows you're still here," Torres said. his face grim. He expected you to run. The fact that you haven't? That concerns him. Concerned men do dangerous things. Torres agreed to help Thomas rebuild, bringing 2 of his own ranch hands who worked in exchange for half of whatever cattle Thomas could acquire. Through Torres, Thomas met other small ranchers, farmers, townspeople who resented Voss's stranglehold on the region, but feared to act alone. Slowly, carefully, Thomas began building a network of people who wanted change, but needed someone to stand up first. Goifle continued to visit, usually at night, teaching Thomas to track, to shoot properly, to survive in the desert. The Apache elder became Thomas's unlikely mentor, sharing knowledge that had kept his people alive in this harsh land for centuries. "Voss thinks he owns the desert," Goifle said one night as they sat by a small fire. "But the desert cannot be owned. It merely tolerates those strong enough to exist within it. You must become one of those, or the sand will swallow you like it swallows everything soft and weak." 3 months after Thomas arrived, the first direct confrontation came. He was repairing a fence line along the northern border of his property when 3 riders appeared. Even from a distance, Thomas recognized them from the descriptions he'd gathered, the Dalton boys. They rode slowly, confidently, like predators circling prey. Jack Dalton, the eldest, was a tall man with a scarred face and dead eyes. He reined up his horse 20 feet from where Thomas stood and smiled without warmth. "You're the Brennan nephew. Heard you were still kicking around this place. Thought you'd have left by now." Thomas carefully set down his tools, keeping his hands visible, but moving toward where his rifle leaned against a fence post. "This is my land. I'm not going anywhere." "See, that's unfortunate," Robert Dalton drawled, scratching his beard. "Because Mr. Voss, he's got plans for this property. Made your uncle a fair offer, God rest his soul. We're prepared to make you the same offer. $500 for the whole spread. More than it's worth, truth be told. Not interested." The 3 riders exchanged glances. Samuel Dalton, the youngest and meanest according to reputation, spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Boy, I don't think you understand the situation. That wasn't really an offer. It was a courtesy. You can take the money and ride out, or what?" Thomas interrupted, his hand now resting on his rifle. "You'll hang me in my stable like you did those Apache warriors? Is that what you do? Murder anyone who stands between Voss and what he wants." The temperature seemed to drop. Jack Dalton's false smile vanished. "You're making accusations you can't prove, son. And even if you could, who'd care about 5 dead Apache? They were stealing horses. They were murdered on my property," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "And Marshal Garrett might not care, but I do. Those men deserve justice. They deserve someone to speak for them. Justice." Jack Dalton laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Boy, the only justice out here is what we make. Remember that." They rode off without further threats, but the message was clear. Thomas had declared himself an enemy. The war Goifle had warned him about had officially begun. The attack started subtly at first. Fences cut in the night. Water troughs poisoned. One of Torres's ranch hands beaten on the road to Socorro, left with broken ribs and a warning to stop helping that eastern fool at the broken spur. Thomas responded by fortifying the ranch house, installing shutters on the windows, keeping weapons loaded and ready. He began sleeping in shifts with Torres's men, always keeping someone on watch. Then they burned his stable. Thomas woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses screaming. He rushed outside to find the rebuilt stable engulfed in flames, the orange light painting the desert like hellfire. The 3 horses he'd purchased were already lost by the time he reached the building, the heat too intense to approach. He could only stand helplessly and watch his work of months burn to ash while figures on horseback sat silhouetted on the distant ridge, watching their handiwork. Goifle found him at dawn, sitting in the ashes, covered in soot. The old Apache said nothing at first. just sat beside Thomas and gazed at the destruction. Finally, he spoke. "They want you to break, to give up, to sell and leave. Will you?" "No," Thomas said, the word coming out like a growl. "I'll rebuild. I'll keep rebuilding until I can't lift a hammer anymore." "Good. Then it's time to stop reacting and start acting." Goyathley's eyes held a fierce light. "You've been playing defense. Now you must go on offense. Voss is powerful, yes, but power has weaknesses. We must find them and exploit them." Over the next month, Thomas and his growing alliance began gathering evidence. Torres knew a clerk in Santa Fe who had access to territorial land records. What they discovered was explosive Voss's claim to nearly half his empire was fraudulent, based on forged documents and property seized through intimidation. If exposed, it could unravel everything he'd built. But they needed more than documents. They needed witnesses willing to testify, proof that could survive in a court of law. Thomas made a dangerous decision. With Goyathley's help, he began interviewing people across the territory who'd suffered under Voss's rule. Families whose land had been stolen. Ranch hands who'd witnessed murders. Even some of Voss's own men, disgruntled and willing to talk in exchange for immunity. He documented everything, built a case file that grew thicker by the week. But building a case took time, and Voss wasn't idle. The attacks escalated. Torres's ranch was raided, cattle stolen, his youngest son shot in the leg during the attack. The Mexican rancher stood firm, refused to back down, but Thomas saw the fear growing in his eyes. How much could he ask these people to sacrifice for his fight? The answer came from an unexpected source. A town meeting was called in Socorro, ostensibly to discuss water rights and territorial development. But everyone knew the real agenda. Voss wanted to publicly pressure Thomas to sell. The entire town turned out, cramming into the church that served as a meeting hall. Voss himself attended, an imposing man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Thomas arrived with Torres Goyathley, who waited outside, knowing his presence would only inflame tensions, and a dozen other small ranchers who joined their cause. The meeting began with Voss's lawyer presenting their offer $1,000 for the broken spur, double the previous offer. The lawyer painted it as generosity, as Voss's desire to help a struggling young man return to civilization. When asked to respond, Thomas stood. His legs shook, but his voice remained steady. He spoke not of money or property, but of justice. He described finding 5 bodies hanging in his stable. He named them Nakitats, Delche, Cochise, Kostaziden, and Nach. He told their stories, the families they left behind, the dreams that died with them. "These men were murdered on my land," Thomas said, his voice carrying through the silent church. "Murdered by the Dalton boys who work for Clayton Voss. And when I asked for justice, I was told to bury them quietly and forget. Well, I've buried them. But I won't forget, and I won't let their deaths be meaningless." He pulled out his file, began reading documented cases of violence, fraud, and corruption. Names, dates, crimes committed in Voss's name. The room grew electric with tension. Some people nodded, others looked terrified. Voss himself sat stone-faced, but Thomas saw his hands clenching the pew in front of him. "You can't prove any of that," Voss's lawyer interjected. "I can," Thomas replied, "and I will. I've filed formal complaints with the territorial governor. I've contacted newspapers in Santa Fe and Denver. I've gathered sworn statements from witnesses. You wanted me gone because I was a complication. Now I'm a threat." Voss stood abruptly. "You're a foolish boy playing at being a man. You think your documents and your righteous indignation matter? This is my territory. These are my people. You're nothing but an Eastern interloper who doesn't understand how things work." "Then teach me," Thomas challenged. "Right here, right now, in front of everyone. Explain how things work. Explain why Apache warriors deserve to hang. Explain why small ranchers lose their land to convenient accidents. Explain how you've acquired 50,000 acres in 20 years. Go ahead. I'm listening. The silence that followed was deafening. Voss's face turned red, then white. Without another word, he stalked from the church, his men following. But before leaving, Jack Dalton turned at the door and looked directly at Thomas. The meaning was clear. This wasn't over. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later, under circumstances Thomas hadn't anticipated. A federal marshal arrived from Santa Fe, a man named James Holloway, who served in the cavalry during the Apache Wars and had a reputation for fairness. Thomas's documented complaints had finally reached someone who cared. Holloway spent a week interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and inspecting territorial records. The case he built against Voss was substantial enough to warrant federal intervention. Arrest warrants were issued for Clayton Voss and the Dalton boys, charging them with fraud, conspiracy, and murder in connection with the deaths of the Apache warriors and several other crimes that came to light during the investigation. Marshal Holloway assembled a posse of territorial deputies and federal officers to serve the warrants. He asked Thomas to guide them to Voss's Three Rivers Ranch, as Thomas had spent months mapping Voss's operation. They rode out at dawn, 15 armed men carrying the weight of federal law. The Three Rivers spread was impressive. Massive hacienda-style ranch house, corrals stretching across acres, hundreds of cattle visible in every direction. Voss's empire, built on blood and intimidation, looked solid as the mountains themselves. But empires fall, Thomas thought, when their foundations are exposed as nothing but sand. Voss didn't surrender quietly. When Marshal Holloway announced the warrants, Voss called his men ranch hands who were really gunfighters and enforcers. For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. 30 of Voss's men faced off against 15 federal officers. The sun beat down mercilessly as both sides calculated odds and consequences. Then Goyathle appeared, riding from the east with 20 Apache warriors, all armed, all watching silently. He'd brought them, he later explained, to ensure justice was done for his son and the others, to witness the white man's law actually working for once. Their presence shifted the balance. Voss's men might fight federal marshals, but none wanted to fight both the law and Apache warriors simultaneously. The Dalton boys tried to flee. They made it half a mile before Goyathle's warriors cut them off, driving them back toward the waiting marshals like wolves herding deer. They surrendered without firing a shot, their legendary meanness evaporating when faced with actual consequences. Voss himself maintained his dignity to the end, surrendering with a sneer and a prediction. "This won't stick," he told Marshal Holloway as the handcuffs clicked shut. "I have friends in Santa Fe, in Washington. You'll see. I'll be free in 6 months, and when I am, everyone who stood against me will remember why they used to fear Clayton Voss." But Voss's confidence proved misplaced. The trial, held in Santa Fe, drew territorial and even national attention. Newspapers sent reporters to cover the Apache lynching case, as it became known. Thomas testified for 3 days, presenting his documentation, his witnesses, his evidence of systemic corruption. Torres and a dozen other ranchers testified about intimidation and violence. Even some of Voss's own former employees turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency. The Dalton boys were convicted of murder and hanged ironically in the same manner they'd hanged their victims. Voss was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and a dozen other charges. He received 25 years in the territorial prison. His empire was dismantled, his land seized and redistributed, much of it going to the small ranchers he'd tried to crush. Thomas returned to the Broken Spur after the trial, exhausted but vindicated. He found the ranch transformed. In his absence, Torres and others had rebuilt the stable, repaired the house, even purchased cattle to stock the ranges. They'd done it, Torres explained, because Thomas had shown them that standing up to power was possible. That justice, though slow and difficult, could prevail. Goethe visited one final time, riding up to the ranch house on a cool autumn evening. He and Thomas sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the desert that had witnessed so much death and pain. "You honored my son," Goethe said quietly. "You honored all of them, not just with burial, but with justice. That is rare, especially between our peoples." "They deserved it," Thomas replied. "No one deserves to die like that and be forgotten. You have become what this land needs," the old Apache continued. "Not just strong, but just. The desert respects that. It will allow you to stay, to build your life here. But remember always what you learned. Power without justice is tyranny. Justice without courage is meaningless." You found both. After Goethe left, riding off into the gathering darkness, Thomas sat alone contemplating the journey that had brought him here. He'd come west expecting inheritance and opportunity. Instead, he'd found murder, corruption, and a test of his character that nearly broke him. But he'd also found purpose, allies, and a new understanding of what it meant to do the right thing when the costs were high and the rewards uncertain. The Broken Spur Ranch thrived in the years that followed. Thomas married Torres's daughter, Maria, and they raised 3 children who grew up speaking both English and Spanish, who learned both Eastern ways and desert wisdom. The ranch became known as neutral ground, a place where Apache and Mexican and white ranchers could meet peacefully to trade and talk. The graves on the hill, his uncles, and the 5 warriors were maintained carefully, never forgotten. Their stories passed down to new generations as a reminder that justice matters, that the dead deserve to be remembered, and that one person's courage can change the course of history, even in the brutal expanse of the Wild West. Thomas often rode up to those graves at sunset, particularly on the anniversary of the day he'd first discovered the bodies in his stable. He'd stand there in the amber light, remembering the fear and horror of that night, the long struggle that followed, the price paid by so many for a piece of desert land. And he'd remember Goethe's final words: "The desert respects justice." In a land where water was scarce and life was hard and violence often ruled, that respect, that justice, became Thomas Brennan's greatest legacy.